by Goan. Welcome to Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek. Hope everybody had a great Christmas, New Year, and whatever other holidays you may celebrate during that period. And if you didn't see my Christmas video, then go give it a look. It's at least kind of funny and probably enjoyable. But this video is also, oddly enough, about Christmas in a sense, because one of my Christmas gifts is the shirt that I am currently wearing, quote by Gildor. And the other Christmas gift that I got is, well, let's just say it's not easy to find. It's the Ace Books edition of The Lord of the Rings, and I'm going to tell you the story of that edition in this video. According to the sources that I have been able to find, Ace Books, which was a publisher in the United States, took advantage of some kind of weird copyright loophole that existed back then in order to publish a paperback edition of The Lord of the Rings, which so far I don't think any paperback version had been published up to that point, at least not in the United States. And apparently they did this by binding it with like the original cover of it or something. It was Tolkien Gateway was kind of sparse on details, and even though I'm a lawyer, I didn't exactly look up the original copyright law back in 1960s to figure out what in the world was going on. But at any rate, the point being, the original Lord of the Rings, of course, was published by Allen and Unwin in Britain. And Ace Books, taking advantage of this copyright loophole and the popularity of the Lord of the Rings, started publishing this paperback edition without authorization from Tolkien or anybody else, and selling them for 75 cents per copy. And by copy, I think it was per volume. But once they started doing this, of course, Allen and Unwin and Tolkien got wind of what was going on. And, of course, they weren't super happy about this. Technically speaking, what Ace Books was doing was not in violation of copyright, apparently, because of the weird loophole that I mentioned earlier. Nevertheless, Tolkien and Allen and Unwin were on the path to try to prevent them from continuing down and, collecting all this money without paying Tolkien royalties. And so what they decided to do was introduce some changes into the text of The Lord of the Rings where possible, update some things in the appendices, add a new preface or prologue, and all that kind of thing so that they could issue a new edition in The Lord of the Rings, which would be protected by copyright, which would then force Ace Books to cease and desist its publication of this basically pirate volume. So what this meant for Tolkien, of course, was a whole lot more work. What ensued was an exchange of letters between Tolkien and several other people kind of documenting this history, and also a new preface to what became the second edition of The Lord of the Rings, in which we can kind of get a chronicle of what was going on, at least in Tolkien's mind at the time. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to look through some of his letters and also the preface to the second edition, which I remember reading a long time ago, but which, oddly enough, you cannot now find in the 50th anniversary edition, which is kind of like the current standard, most correct version. Most of the preface is there, but there's a final paragraph referring to Ace Books, which is no longer present in the preface. It's only in the older copies of the book. So, let's take a look at sort of the chronology through the lens of Tolkien's letters and the preface. So the first major entry in the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien on this topic is a letter to Rayner Unwin, in which he is acknowledging the receipt of the returned copy of Smith of Wootton Major, which he had submitted previously as a thing to possibly publish. Of course, he does eventually publish Smith of Wootton Major, but at this stage, he's in the process of saying, here's something you might publish, and the copy of it was sent back. And in the course of this letter, he basically says, I'm still in the middle of trying to edit The Lord of the Rings because of this infernal copyright business, quote unquote. And he also mentions that it's taking up a lot of his time. In a follow-up letter, or what appears to be basically a follow-up letter, he mentions that in reviewing The Lord of the Rings for possible changes, he has come to admire, quote, the tightness of the author's construction, and basically ended up saying he hoped that the changes that he was planning to make, which mainly consisted of adding an index, updating the appendices, and adding a prologue or preface, would be sufficient for the copyright purposes they had in mind. This letter is actually really interesting because in mentioning all this, he basically says something along the lines of, I don't feel that much of a connection to the author at this point. It's almost like a friend with whom I have a relatively loose acquaintance. Like, I don't know this person like I should. Because all of that, it's kind of like a brain dump, I guess. Once Tolkien had finally finished all the hard work on The Lord of the Rings and let it go, it was just this cathartic, release of everything. And so by the time we get to this point, which is in the mid-1960s, he almost doesn't even remember, who he was at the time anymore. I've had experiences like this myself because whenever I was in law school, I had finals for that first year, and it was the hardest I had ever worked for anything mentally. And what would happen, and it was the strangest experience ever, was I would study my, brains out, almost literally it seemed, and I would acquire all this information, and then I would get to the exam and I would dump it all out. And then after that, I almost couldn't even remember what the exam was about anymore. And so I kind of wonder if Tolkien had a similar experience where he had spent so much mental energy on this thing that by the time it was all over and he kind of dumped it, it's like that part of him was just no longer inside his head. And therefore, it was almost like a third-person view of what was going on. And that's why he refers to himself in the third person in this letter. And he's, but when he says he admires the tightness of the construction, he's basically saying, I can't find a whole lot I can change because everything is so tightly constructed that if I change much, it's going to really upset, too many things. It's going to cause a ripple effect. And so that's why he's like, I'm kind of stuck with just the appendices, adding an index and the preface. Like, I can't do much here. Of course, those familiar with the differences between the first edition and the second edition will know that there were corrections made to certain things and this sort of thing. But there certainly were no major upheavals in the main text of the book itself. In the first of these two letters, also, I should mention, he did tell Rayner Unwin that every time he wrote a letter back to an American reader who was, very enthusiastic about his work and wrote him a fan letter, he would basically write him back an acknowledgement, at least, saying, hey, thanks for your letter. And he would add a note saying, oh, by the way, the Ace Books version is a pirate edition. Please don't read that one and tell all your friends not to read that one. So he begins this, direct campaign to his readers saying, don't buy this version. It's not authorized. So that's kind of before even this, the whole process of trying to reestablish his copyright gets going. He's already trying, just through direct means, to reach his fans to say, don't buy this unauthorized copy. In this vein, he then later writes a letter to a woman named Nan Scott, thanking her for her efforts in keeping the Ace Books edition out of bookstores. Apparently, she is one of these fans whom he wrote, telling, this is a pirate edition, and she apparently begins like a one-woman campaign going to bookstores, telling them, hey, this is not an authorized edition of this book. They did this without, authorization from the author. Like, don't sell it. And Tolkien writes her thanking her for her efforts, which is, this is the kind of fan base that Tolkien got. It's like nobody wanted to even pirate his works because once they found out that, this was a pirate edition, they're like, oh no, we're not going to stand for that. We're going to go to all the bookstores and tell them to ban this. Which, it's just wonderful to think about this woman going around and going to a bookstore and be like, hey, I noticed you're carrying the Ace Books copy of this. Don't sell that. They're pirates. It's just beautiful imagery right there. So we do get some indication that his strategy of direct contact with his fans actually had some, effect early on. Further evidence of the effectiveness of this campaign comes in a letter that he wrote to his son Michael, where he basically tells him Yeah, Ace Books has been banned from many institutions over this. Apparently, and it's not clear from his letter if he means just, the Ace Books version of The Lord of the Rings, or if he means Ace Books in general. Like, their reputation had just taken such a hit over this that people weren't selling any of their books. But either way, he tells Michael that they've been banned from many institutions and that, this campaign has apparently been really effective. He also mentions that it was discovered that the Ace Books version had a bunch of errors in it compared to the, official edition that was authorized by, Allen and Unwin. So there were actually reasons not to buy it even independently of all of that stuff. And he also said to Michael that he thought all the rumpus would actually, that was his word, not mine. We might say hoopla, brouhaha, whatever. But he basically said he thought that because of all the publicity that this was generating, that when he got around to finally finishing and publishing the authorized version, that it would actually get better sales than it would have otherwise. So, ironically, after all this, even though he's been pirated, it looks like Tolkien's going to come out better than he might have if it hadn't been for Ace Books in the first place. There's another brief mention of this in another letter to Allen and Unwin where he is talking about, again, publishing some stuff. In this case, it's talking about the Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and Pearl and maybe even Sir Orfeo. In modern editions, you'll find all three poems in one volume, but it only references Gawain and Pearl. But he basically tells him, like, I was working on this, and I really had my mind on it, and then all the copyright business came up, and I had to put it aside, and now it's like going back, basically complaining about the fact that, I was really in the zone, and I was working on this, and I was in the mode to work on this, and then got interrupted, and it's a real shame. Not really a whole lot else to this letter in regards to Ace Books, but it's kind of a downer compared to the Michael letter, because in that one he's talking about how everything looks like it's actually going to turn out really well, and here it's like, yeah, but it also interrupted a lot of things and made him have to work on stuff that he shouldn't have to work on, and the next thing you know, he's like behind on all his projects all over again. And this is the story of Tolkien's life. He's constantly got something that he needs to do, and it interrupts what he wants to do, or, something like that. It's, there's always something competing for his attention. And unfortunately, that is one of the downsides of the Ace Books fiasco, is it took his attention away from things that he could have otherwise gotten done. What might he have finished if he hadn't had to do this that, he didn't end up finishing? We'll never know. But, it's not like we don't have Sir Gawain and Pearl. But might he have had time to finish that sooner and then move on to other things that he might have done? Who knows? The final letter that is recorded in at least the original version of the letters, there's a new version coming out, as many of you know, which may have more stuff on this, I don't know. But the final letter in the original version of the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien is actually a letter to W.H. Auden, with whom he had a fairly friendly correspondence over many years, and was, if I remember right, actually his student at one point. And in this letter, he writes a bunch of things, but he also mentions the Ace Books situation and says that he actually managed to reach an amicable agreement with Ace in which they would pay him back royalties for the copies they had already sold and agree not to republish it once they ran out without his consent, which of course they never got. Because by that point, he had already managed to get Ballantine Books to publish an authorized version. So Ace Books never published another edition or, second round of printing of The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien got royalties out of it, and so everybody ended up kind of happy out of the whole situation. That's the story of the Ace Books saga as told by his letters, but one of my favorite things on this topic is a piece from the preface to the second edition, which I will read portions of because it's characteristic Tolkien all over. So again, this is from the final paragraph to the preface to the second edition, which that final paragraph, I almost gaslit myself on this because my old copy of The Lord of the Rings I had lent to somebody else, and then I had another box set, which I'm pretty sure has the same exact preface, somewhere in storage because we still have a ton of stuff that we haven't been able to unpack yet. Just, it's weird. But anyway, I was looking for this in my ebook version of The Lord of the Rings, which is based on the 50th anniversary edition. And I could not find the reference that I was looking for. And it's like, I am so sure this is there. And so the person that I loaned it to, I asked, hey, do you still have that? I need to look at the Fellowship of the Ring. And so I got it back and I read it. And sure enough, what I remembered being there was there. So I'm not crazy and I was, not gaslighting myself. But what he says in this preface is just lovely. It's so Tolkien. So he says, I hope that those who have read The Lord of the Rings with pleasure will not think me ungrateful. To please readers was my main object, and to be assured of this has been a great reward. Nonetheless, for all its defects of omission and inclusion, it was the product of long labor, and like a simple-minded hobbit, I feel that it is, while I am still alive, my property in justice, unaffected by copyright laws. In other words, even though Ace Books is technically on the right side of the law, that's still not cool. It seems to me a grave discourtesy, to say no more, to issue my book without even a polite note informing me of the project, dealing as one might expect of Saruman and his decay rather than from the defenders of the West. You just can't get more Tolkien than that. It's just great. However that may be, this paperback edition, and no other, has been published with my consent and cooperation. Those who approve of courtesy, at least, to living authors will purchase it and no other. And if the many kind readers who have encouraged me with their letters will add to their courtesy by referring friends or inquirers to Ballantine Books, I shall be very grateful. So, the whole reference to behavior, that is appropriate to Saruman and not the defenders of the West, and, the importance of courtesy, it's like, this is so Tolkien. So many things about Tolkien can be summed up in those words because he places a huge emphasis on courtesy, and he refers to Saruman many times in the course of his life as, kind of an analog to people in the real world who are not okay in his book. So it's just, and of course he refers to himself as a hobbit many times too, and here he says, like a simple-minded hobbit. I would have thought that at least courtesy would, lead anybody to not do this. So it's just, it's a great capstone to the whole thing, and it's just, it's a fun story too, because like I said, there are kind of positives and negatives that come out of it. Positives in the sense that he ends up getting the royalties from Ace Books, and possibly more publicity for the release of his authorized version than he would have gotten, and therefore more sales than he would have gotten. But on the other hand, it took away from so many other things he had to do in his life because he had to go through all this work to put out a new edition that could get the copyright protection he needed to force Ace Books out of the market. So, again, what might have happened if it weren't for this? What might we have gotten? We don't know. But it's a fun story, if only because how many times do you really learn about pirate editions of things? But it also shows the level of popularity that Tolkien had even at that time. And this is before, the massive surges in popularity that would come later, because at one point, The Lord of the Rings became a little bit of a cult classic, but it didn't have huge, broad appeal. But eventually that would come. But even at this early stage, in the early 1960s, when this all started, it was popular enough that a bookseller was like, hey, let's take advantage of this. There's a copyright loophole over here. We don't have to pay Tolkien royalties, and we'll just print the book and make some money off of it. That people don't pirate things that are not popular. That's not how that works. I mean, if you're just an individual pirating something for your own benefit, sure, but a bookseller is not going to pirate something at a large scale to sell if it's not popular, because it won't be worth the effort. So it did have some popularity even, from the start. And it's also just heartwarming to know that there are people like Nan Scott running around, going to booksellers and being like, now you take that book off your shelf, that doesn't belong there. It's just, There's just so many fun twists and turns in this story. But that is basically the story of Ace Books and their pirate edition of The Lord of the Rings, which I now own a copy of. I'm not sure if that makes me a pirate or not. I obviously didn't buy it for myself. It was a Christmas gift, as I mentioned earlier. But, so I'm not saying anything. But it's hard to find. And I have to say, this edition is in pretty good shape. It was... like this one, you can't even see wrinkles on the spine. So the Two Towers, it's a little more wrinkled, but this copy is actually in extremely good shape for its age and considering what it is. So I'm very appreciative of that and thankful to the person who gave it to me, whom I will not name, of course, on the video, but very appreciative, and it was a great opportunity to share this story with my viewers that I have not told, surprisingly, on this channel before. I realized, why have I not already talked about this? But now I have a great opportunity to do so. So, hope you enjoyed that. Hope you are having a great new year so far in 2024. We will have plenty of additional Tolkien content this year, as usual. If you enjoyed this one, please do give it a thumbs up and share it around, especially for anybody interested in copyright law and Tolkien, which, that's kind of a small theme on my channel anyway. And if you want to catch more of my content, make sure you subscribe, of course, wherever you're watching or listening. Hit the bell icon if you're on YouTube to make sure you don't miss any notifications. Check the description for social and support links, as well as some other things. And until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Marie. Thanks to all my channel supporters, especially elf friends Paul Leone, Nathan Dufour, and Robert Kendling.